Okay. All right. So I want to start by correcting what we did on, let's see, on Monday. We had some trouble with the error handling for an AJAX request. And so I went back and looked at this, and it turns out Marty had the slides completely wrong, like just totally wrong. He was sort of used to doing it similar to the way I'm used to doing it with the JavaScript library. And it just doesn't work the way he specified, just doing it without a JavaScript library. So we're just going to do a reboot on this real quick. So there are two types of ways that the request can fail. And we talked about these on Monday. First, the server we might be able to successfully contact the server, and the server might successfully respond to us, but it might indicate to us that there was an error. This is not what you asked for. This is an error message that indicates that you did something wrong, or I did something wrong, or something somehow went wrong. So that's one type of error, and we can call that a server error. So this is an error that was sent to us by the server. It's given to us by the server. The other type of failure is what we can call a browser error. The browser never actually made the request to begin with. So this can only happen for two reasons that I can think of. Either the browser blocked the request because we tried to make the request to a different domain. And if you remember, we can't make AJAX requests to a different domain. We have to make AJAX requests to the same origin as the JavaScript file. So if our JavaScript file came from webster.cs.washington.edu, we can only make AJAX requests to webster.cs.washington.edu. In my case, I'm almost always running through my web server on my local computer instead of through the web server on Webster. So whatever web server you're running on, whatever web server the JavaScript file comes from, that JavaScript file can only make AJAX requests back to the same server. So maybe you tried to make an AJAX request to a different server, so the browser blocked that request, didn't even send it. Or you just don't have an internet connection, so the browser just couldn't even make the request at all. So this second failure we can call a browser error. The first error we can call a server error, and these two errors are handled differently. The server error is handled in the same way that we handle a successful response. So we still use ajax.onload. Or, by the way, somebody asked on Monday, can you use add-event-listener? Yes, you can use add-event-listener on this. I looked it up. So in our onload success handler function, we have to differentiate between a successful response and an unsuccessful response. That is a response that indicates that this is what you asked for, or a response that indicates this is not what you asked for, this is an error message. So in here, we have to basically just have an if-else statement to say, well, is this a 200? Is the status code a 200? If so, I'm gonna handle it normally. Otherwise, I'm gonna have some other code to handle this as an error. So we use the same onload event for a successful response as we use for an unsuccessful response from the server. And so you have to use the error code to differentiate between the two. Handling a browser error, this is where we go into the on-error event handler. An on-error event handler is called in the case of a browser error. The browser was unable to even make the request to begin with. So this is where we would put our code to handle a browser error. And if you want to use both of those together, which you should do, you should always use both of those together. You will want an on-error and an on-load. Your on-error is the one that will handle the browser error, and your on-load is going to handle both a successful response and an error response from the server. So it's going to handle anything that actually comes back from the server. So feel free to use these alerts in your homework assignment. I think the homework assignment, unless otherwise specified, you can feel free to use these kinds of alerts. Previously, in the examples that were up here, there were things like in here, the slide said that it passed an exception, and you could do something with the exception. It doesn't actually do that. It does that with a library that Marty used to use for this class, but it doesn't anymore. So this should be fully correct now. So sorry for the confusion on that. Okay, and let's see. Did I want to do? Okay, well, basically, what I've updated the quotes example from that we did on Monday to incorporate this. So we've got, let's see, we've got an on load and we've got an on error. Our on load got new quote differentiates between a success status and an error status, and if there was an error, it alerts. And our on error is this. It alerts a different error that says maybe the browser blocked the request or you don't have an internet connection or something. So that's the new modified code that will be posted. Okay, the next thing we wanted to get to, finish up on from Monday, was the animal game. So we looked at this, the animal game, the animal game, and we played this and it was funny, and we're going to do this. So we play the animal game. It's basically like the 143 20 questions homework assignment. If you've done that, it asks you a series of questions, yes or no questions. Does it, does it fly? Does it have feathers? Does it sometimes live in water? Blah blah blah. And eventually, it gets to the point where it has a guess of what your animal is that you're thinking of, and it says, "Is your animal a penguin or whatever?" And you can click yes or no. And if you click yes, then it's like, yeah, I won. I guessed it. If you say no, then it allows you to, if you're logged in, it allows you to submit a new question that differentiates between your animal, and the animal it was thinking of, and also specify what animal you were thinking of. So what we're going to do is we're going to, let's see, lectures. We're going to do that same thing. In this right here, so we're going to be making requests to a PHP script, and that PHP script is going to be giving us XML data, and we're going to be reading that XML data and using that to populate a question here and handle. We're going to be using JavaScript to handle the yes and no stuff going on there. I just remembered I need to download another file here, so hang on real quick. Go. Let's see. Where's that? Okay. Let me move this into the right directory real quick. Okay, this should do it real quick. Okay, root. Okay. So we're going to be making requests to this animalgame.php program. Oops. User root password blank name animal game. There we go. So when we don't pass a parameter, it says please supply a node ID. When we supply a node ID, we're going to begin with the first node ID, node ID equals 1. And this is going to be the first question node. It's an XML document. If we look at the source here, we can see the full XML. It's got the XML prologue. The root node here is node to indicate that it's a question node. And its ID is 1. And the question is, can it fly? If the answer to that is yes, then we need to load node ID 13. If the answer is no, then we need to load node ID of 5. And if we load node ID of 13, if we load node ID of 13, then we will node ID of 13, then we go to the next question, and then the next question, and so on. So, and then eventually we're going to get to the point where we have, instead of a question node here, we're going to have an answer, and then we're not going to have a yes or no node. We'll get to that in a sec. But we're not going to have a yes or no node because then there's no node to proceed to after that. But this is going to be an answer instead of a question. Okay, so let's start writing some code here, HTML. What we want to do first is maybe when the page loads, we want to load the initial question and populate it here. So why don't we go ahead and do that? Animalgame.html. We have, let's see, we have a container here for the question. Can't increase my font size anymore. Okay. We have a field set for the question, and we have a question paragraph there. This is where the question is going to go. We have a yes button and a no button. So let's write our JavaScript file. Get rid of this prototype. Animalgame.js. So we're going to write animalgame.js. Okay, so we're going to start with the usual stuff, window.add event listener load. Is going to do this, and when that happens, we'll just sort of stump out click handlers for the yes or no button. So we'll say document.get element by ID yes dot add event listener click yes click. And we'll do the same thing for no. Okay, so we have these two functions that'll get run there. We also will need a function to load the question, right? So we'll maybe have a load function here. And in here, we're going to initiate an AJAX request to the PHP script. So we'll say var xhr equals new XML HTTP request, create the AJAX object. XHR dot, we're going to have to set up our callback function in advance. XHR dot onload equals, got node. Maybe we'll call it that. Got node. XHR dot open. It's going to be a GET request, and we're going to make it to animalgame.php, and we want it to be asynchronous. XHR.send. Okay. So this will initiate our AJAX request. Problem is, so we need to actually specify a node ID to load. Okay, so we initially need to load node ID of 1. Why don't we just leave it like that for now? And then in got_node here, we're going to, how do we get access to the data that came back? Actually, why don't we just alert, foo here just to make sure that this works. Okay, so we're going to have to call load here when the page loads. We'll call it load node. Okay, load node. Okay, it alerts foo. Let's go take a look at the net tab here. We'll refresh, and we can see the AJAX request went out. We made a request to animalgame.php, passing in the node ID parameter. That's the parameter we passed. Here's the response. It's an XML. This is exactly what we saw before. Okay, so how do we get access to the data that came back? This, so inside of got node, we can say this dot something, dot value. So there's there are two properties that are automatically populated that contain the data that we're looking for in two different formats. Do you remember what those are? So let's go take a look at, here we go, XML. So normally, so if it's like text or HTML or something, then we want to do something with this.response text. But if it's XML, then the browser is automatically going to parse the XML into a DOM object that that we can do DOM functions and methods on, and that is this.response XML. So this.response XML is something that we're going to be doing something with. So on this, we can do like query selector all, or we can do get elements by tag name. So those, all this sort of the standard DOM stuff, standard DOM querying functions we can run on this. So how would we get the question? So we have the, I wish Firebug would just, it used to be that it would stay open in this tab, and then in the other tab it could be closed, but it doesn't do that anymore. So how do we get access to the question? Query selector question. Is this all? So if we alerted this, what would happen? Yeah, we need to look inside of this. This is a node, so .querySelector question gives us a node, but the node like is an object. We need to get the text inside of that object. So we'll just alert this just to see what it does. It says object element. So this is an XML element. And that's not very useful. What we want is the text inside of it, and there are two different ways that we can do that. Do you remember those? There is, here we go, .text content and .firstChild.node value. So we can do either of those. We'll just do .text content. I think the only reason why you'd want to use .firstChild.node value, I mean, it's longer and uglier, but I think it's more browser compatible. So if you really want compatibility with lots of older browsers, then you probably want to use that instead of text content. But I think most modern browsers support text content. Okay, so text content, if we refresh that, we actually have the question, the text of the question outside of that node. Then we can go ahead and inject that into the, let's see, we want to put that in the question paragraph. So var qp equals document.get element by id question paragraph qp dot what? Inner HTML. I think we can actually do text content because everything that applies in the XML DOM also applies in the HTML DOM. The reverse is not true, so we couldn't use .inner HTML over here because this is an XML object. But I think we can do the reverse. Let's just try it. There we go. Yep. Typically we use inner HTML, but text content, that totally works. Okay, so we've got a question. We want to make it so that when we click yes, we'll load the yes node, and if we click no, we'll load the no node. So we've already got event handlers attached here, this yes click and no click. When we click on the yes button, it'll call yes click, and same thing with no click. Mm-hmm. Okay. He said, would it be easier if we made a single click handler and passed in yes or no? Less redundant. Well, so I think we're going to have to do different things in each of these. Like we're going to have to load a new node in each of them, but we're going to have to get a yes element in here and a no element in here. Which yeah, okay. I guess we could. Well, let's flesh out one of these first, and we can flesh out both of these, and then we can see if we can factor out the redundancy. It was Knuth who said, Donald Knuth, a famous computer scientist, who said. Oh, I'm going to forget the quote now. What did he say? Premature. What is it? Somebody know this quote? It's a really famous quote. Premature optimization is the root of all evil. That's what he said. Premature optimization is the root of all evil. So if we try to factor out redundancy and optimize our code too early, then before we can see exactly how it should be factorized, then it leads to a lot of problems sometimes. So we'll just do it this way for now. So we can say we want to get access to the node ID, so the yes and the no, right? So in the yes, we want to get access to the yes. How do we get access to the yes node? Pretty much like this, right? Although, let's see, so we're gonna have to, well, actually, so we can't use this.response.xml because this is a click handler. So inside of the click handler, this is the button, right? So that doesn't work. We can't use this.response.xml. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we can, so we have access to the data in this function. We have, this.response.xml allows us to get access to the yes node and the no node. And we need access to it over here and over here. And the only way to get access to the same data across functions is to either pass a parameter or create a global variable. In this case, we can't pass a parameter because this event, this yes click event, happens completely independently from the got node event. The got node event happens, we find the data, we have the data, and then sometime later on, the user clicks a button. They're completely separate events. So we're going to have to actually store the data in a global variable. So let's var yes ID equals null, or we can make it 0, I guess. Var node or no ID equals 0. Okay, so then we can say yes ID equals something along this line, right? This.response.xml.querySelector yes. Then how do we get the ID? So this is not the text content, right? The text content is the text inside of an element. This is a self-closing element. And it has an attribute, right? Yeah, so we need to call get attribute on it. So dot get attribute node ID. And then same thing for no. Yes, no. Okay. So then down here in yes click we can say, okay, I want to load. Aha, yes, this is why you said to make a single click handler. So we need to load the node with the ID of yes ID. Okay, so how are we going to load a specific particular node? Do we have a function that we can use for that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we should probably parameterize this so we can specify which node to load. We'll say load the node with this ID, and we'll just add that ID to the string, right? So we can parameterize that, and then when we load the page, we know we always want to load the first node, so we'll load the node with ID of 1. And then here we can say yes ID, no ID. Okay. Can it fly? Yes. Does it have feathers? Yes. Excellent. Let's just make sure that no works. Excellent. Let's refresh, and we'll go all the way through yes. I think if we go all the way through yes, it's not only funny, but it's kind of short actually. So does it sometimes stand on one leg? It's not pink or stands on one leg, is it? That's not a yes or no question. Whatever. Is it some kind of jellyfish? Does it have legs? Is it not real? Does it have stripes? Is it white? Is it a male? Is it yellow? Is it related to the cat family? Can it be all animals? Are you going to click yes to the last question? No, blah, blah, blah. Can I do everything? Okay, now we've gotten to the end, and we have an error. We have a JavaScript error that popped up there. We can see all these AJAX requests that we've made for particular nodes. And then, so at the very end, we get this.response.xml.querySelector, blah, 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 is null. This.response.xml.querySelector question is null. Yeah, so let's look at the last request here. And the last request, so all requests up until that point have a question and a yes and a no element. This one has just an answer. It doesn't have a yes or a no. And the answer is your animal God? So let's see. So we're going to have to handle that case differently. So there might not be a question in this.response.xml. So there might be an answer instead. So how are we going to handle the case where it's an answer instead of a question? Yeah, so we can so it said this.response.xml.querySelector question is null. So why don't we say var question node equals that. Then we can say if question node, i.e. if it's not null, then we can do question node dot text content. Bam. qp.text content equals question node dot text content, and we can do all the yes nodes, yes and no stuff. Else there isn't a question node, so we're going to have to get the answer node. So we'll say qp.text content equals answer dot text content. Actually, just to be consistent, we'll do this. We'll say var answer node, answer, and we'll say answer node. Okay. qp.text content equals answer node dot text content. And then, so we also want to make it so that once we get to this point, once we're answering a question, or once it's making a guess, then when we click yes, then that means, oh yes, that was the right answer. And if we click no, then the computer lost basically. So this is the computer won, this is the computer lost. So we're going to have to adapt this as well, so that once we've reached this point, we're no longer trying to load new nodes. But why don't we just do this first? So we'll do all the way through. Oh, so the question doesn't have children. These three are all siblings of each other, and they're all children of node. So we could look at this nodes dot child nodes to see if it was 1 or 3, but then I think actually the output here has white space and stuff, so we've got these white space text nodes here, those really annoying white space text nodes, so the number of nodes is going to be weird. So I think it's probably easier if we just look for the question node. If the question node isn't there, then we'll look for the answer node. Okay, so when we actually, so let's modify this a little bit. So we don't want it to just say the name of the animal. We want it to actually ask a question. Is your animal colon and then like a question mark? So blah, blah, blah. Do everything. Is your animal God? Okay, so now we want to make it so that when you click yes here, it doesn't try to load a new node. So let's see. So the last request was for this particular node ID 23428, and so that was the second to last, and then the last one was for that same node. So we want to, because we haven't modified yes ID from the previous time. So we're gonna need to modify. We're gonna need to do something so that when we get to this state, when we click yes, then it says like maybe we'll inject into the text, "Yay, I won," or if it's no, we'll inject in the text, "Boo, I lost," something like that. Any ideas how to go about that? So I think, so there are a couple different approaches we could take. We could either set like a global flag or something up here. We could say var, end of game equals false or something. And then once we get to here, we can say, end of game equals true, something like that. And then down here, we can just check that flag. For some reason, I like to do it this way instead. I like to do it like this. We'll say yes ID equals 0, no ID equals 0. And then down here, we can just say if yes ID, then we'll load that. Else, this is where we want to display a message. We want to display a message. We want to say, let's see, question paragraph dot text content equals woo, I won. And then down here we can say like if no ID, then we load that, else we put a message in the question paragraph that says boo, I lost. I don't really think it's necessarily better or worse. A flag would be just as good, yeah. Yeah, I prefer it this way for some reason, but that's kind of arbitrary. That's just kind of personal choice. There's in the quotes example that we were using, I was reading through that the other night and correcting the typos because there were so many typos in it. And it said something about computer science is not about best and worst, but like better choices and less good choices. It's not about good and bad, but about better and worse choices. And really, like, this is not, neither of these is a better or worse choice than the other, really. Okay, so if we click through yes all the way, so what's the last one? Can it be all animals? Can it do everything? So this is the last one. When we click yes, it should say as the answer God. and yes, woo, I won. Of course, now if we click no, then it says, boo, I lost. So maybe after this, we'll want to disable the game so that they can, so the buttons don't work anymore. So like, yeah, here we go. So like, disable. We will get, so document.get element by ID yes, dot enable disabled equals true, right? And no. All the way through. Who I want, and I can't click yes or no anymore. Okay, so that's the animal game. And that's a great example of using XML as data, receiving XML from a web service, from this program here, this PHP script that outputs XML, and we're going to be continually making new AJAX requests to fetch new information. Okay, let's move on to some new material for today. We're going to be finishing up AJAX by learning another data format. So we've learned how to inject plain text content into the page. We learned how to inject XML content into the page by extracting data from XML and injecting the data into the HTML DOM. Now we're going to learn about a third format. This is quickly becoming one of the most popular formats, if not the most popular format now. It may have surpassed XML by now. So Douglas Crockford, one of the gurus of JavaScript, has said that Json is now becoming the X in AJAX. XML is great. It's a great format, but it's not without its flaws. It's a standard. It's an open format. It's universally accepted. It's a great format. Can represent almost any kind of data you want. It's really easy to read. Like, it's very self-descriptive. It's easy to read both for humans and for computers, which is great. And there's just, because it's a standard and it's universal, there are tons of programs you can use to analyze the data and fetch data from it quickly and easily. On the other hand, it's pretty big. So, like, if you look at the example that we had oh, actually no, if we look at XML, let's look at the Wikipedia page for XML. There are examples here of comparisons to other, let's see, maybe it's not on this page. Math XML, MathML. Here we go. Other standards. No, let's see. Here we go. Okay, example in comparison to other formats. So this is the quadratic formula. We're all hopefully familiar with the quadratic formula. And this is how that syntax will be marked up in a different language. This is a language called LaTeX. This is very popular amongst like academics for like writing papers and submitting to journals and stuff like that. This is a very popular format. It's very clear and concise. This is another format. It's also clear and concise. Let's see, OpenOffice, Math. That's also clear and concise. Blah, blah, blah. And this is how that would be represented in XML. So this, 30 lines of code. This is how the same thing is represented, much less concisely in XML. So XML is great, but it can never be said to be succinct, really. And so that's probably its biggest drawback, is that it's very very bulky. It can be difficult to put data into an XML format, but I guess that applies to any format really. And using the DOM is not really very fun. It's kind of clunky. So this is an example that we looked at on Monday of XML data. We have this note. It's easy to read and understand. It can be parsed using the DOM, but JavaScript happens to be able to use another format very easily, and that's called Json. It stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It was invented by Douglas Crockford, and it's basically it's become a format that's used interchangeably across different languages, not just using JavaScript. The idea is when you create an object in JavaScript, so this is how you create a literal object in JavaScript. You just say, var whatever equals, and then in curly braces, you specify keys and values, key, value, and so on. So this is a property, this is its value. The property can be just a variable, it can be a method, it can be anything you want. So if we create a point object, this is how we create a point object. Super clean, super efficient. We just have these curlies. We have a key of x and a value of y of 4, key of y, value of 3, and this goes into this point object. We can say point.z, point.x, whatever. So we can do lots of stuff with this very concise format. More examples of this. If we want to represent a person, we can have their name, their age, their weight. We can also mix types. So this here is an array. So the value of friends is an array. This is a method. So let's see, person.age. We can also use this alternate syntax here. We can use the associative array syntax to get stuff out of an object, which is pretty cool. It's a great feature of JavaScript. You can use associative arrays and objects in JavaScript are very, very similar. I think there's actually technically a difference between them, but basically you use an object just like an associative array. Person.friends bracket 2 would be Zoidberg, and person.getBeloved, that would be this.name loves Leela, so this.name is Philip J. Fry, loves Leela. Okay. So inside of this object, we can put lots of different things, and we can embed data structures to an arbitrary depth. We can have an object inside of one of these values, just like we have an array here, and it's just super clear and concise and easy to use. So if we have the XML data here, if we want to express this as a JavaScript object, then we can represent it like this. Private is true, from is Alice Smith, to, now we have an array here representing the number 2 people that it's addressed to. Subject is this, message is this, and we have an attribute here that indicates that its language is English, and the text of the message is this. So this is the same data represented in a different format. This is a JavaScript object. So a JavaScript object gets converted to JSON. So JSON is not strictly synonymous with a JavaScript object. So you notice that here we don't have any kind of variable declaration. We're not saying like var foo equals this, semicolon, right? So in order to, but we could do that in our JavaScript code. We could have something up here in our JavaScript code that says var foo equals that, semicolon. That is a valid JavaScript declaration of this entire object. The idea behind JSON is that it takes this concise syntax and you basically just remove the variable declaration, and now you've got a JSON object. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So we're using the same syntax and notation as we used to declare an object in JavaScript, to just store this in a file. So this is something that would be stored in a file. And it would be stored in a file with a .json file extension. If we added, other JavaScript-related syntax, like var foo equals that semicolon, now this is JavaScript code. Instead of just a JSON object, this is JavaScript code. So the idea behind JSON is that you can store objects just using the same syntax that you use to create them in JavaScript in a file. So this is basically how you convert a JavaScript object to JSON. There are certain rules in JSON that are, JSON is a little bit more strict than JavaScript in how it allows you to declare an object. First of all, single quotes are not allowed. You have to double quote everything in every string in JSON. Single quotes are allowed in JavaScript, but in JSON is sort of a subset of the syntax. So JSON prohibits single quotes. The other thing is, in JavaScript, it allows you to not put strings around the key, this property name here. So this is valid JavaScript, but in JSON, it requires that you quote all property names. And because single quotes are not allowed, you're required to double quote them. It also doesn't represent complex objects like a date object. We haven't really done anything with the date object yet, but it doesn't allow you to store that. It also doesn't allow you to store functions inside of the object. So basically, if we delete all the stuff that's crossed out here, and we add the quotes around this, and we fix the quotes around this, now this is a valid JSON object. And we can just store that in a file with the file name of .json, a file extension of .json. So if we read in a JSON file, we can parse the contents of the file. If this is a string containing the contents of the file, we can parse that. And what this function returns is the JavaScript object that string represents. So this returns a JavaScript object. We can just reach into that JavaScript object and just get its properties and get properties of the properties and like access array elements and things like that. If you have a JavaScript object that you want to turn into JSON, then you pass the JavaScript object to json.stringify, and that returns a string that is the JavaScript object notation for that object. So these are the built-in methods in the browser. So for example, if we, and typically the way that we load actually the only real way that we can load JSON using the browser is through an AJAX request. So in our AJAX success handler function, then we're going to be getting JSON back. We're going to be parsing the response text as JSON, and that creates this data object. From that point on, this data object we can reach into, and we can get properties of it and get access array elements and things like that. So how do we get access to the Windows title of this data object? So if this data object, so if this .response text is this JSON code here, then how would we reach into this data object and get the Windows title? So this has to use the console. I'm guessing that, so data is an object that's defined. Yeah, so we've got a data object here with a window, an image, and messages. Can't scroll down, but we've got these properties here. So if I want to use this as a JavaScript object, how do I get the Windows title? .window .title. There you go. So we use this just like a JavaScript object. This has a property of window, and that window is an object which itself has a property of title. and we just get the value for that. The image's third coordinate. So there's another property called image. It has a property called coords, which is an array. So we'd say data dot image. My autocomplete is telling me what to do. Dot what?
Suppose you created an object within an object.
Yeah, so that's actually what we're doing here. So this is an object within an object. So this entire thing here is an object. It has a property called window that is an object. And that object,
And then the object, you make an object up there, and if there's another object as a parent, an object within
within
the window object.
this window object. So this window object here, this isn't like the global window object. This is like an object within this data object. So this data object has a property called window, and inside of window we have an object with keys and values. So data is itself an object, and then data.window is also an object. Data.image is also an object, and so on. Data.image.coords is an array. And this array, if we want to get the image's third coordinate, we would say data.image.coords bracket what? 2. 0, because it's zero-based indexing. Okay. The number of messages. Let's see, we've got messages. So messages is an array because it's got the square brackets there. Messages is an array, and each element of that array is an object. So each element of this array is an object. Yeah.
You're running out of time, so just go.
Oh, the homework. Yes, thank you. Okay, we'll do that. We'll do that in just a sec. So let's finish this slide real quick. Data.messages dot. Okay, so data.messages is an array. Data.messages bracket 0 is the first message, and its text is save. And if we want to get offset, 10, 20, so that's an array. We can get, the 1th index of that, and so on. So we can reach into this object and we can get properties, and some of those properties can be arrays and so on. And it can be sort of arbitrarily nested. Great thing about this is that you can use this in response to an AJAX request. So if this is our AJAX request handler, we look at this.response text, we parse that into a JSON object, and instead of having to call DOM methods and properties to access everything, this just becomes like an array. We just loop over the array and we just get a property of it, data.books, the ith book. We look at its title, and we can look at its author and so on. So we'll do an example of this on Friday. But for now, let's go ahead and check out the homework assignment. So next week's homework assignments. Oops. Actually, let's see. Okay, your next week's homework assignment is one of my favorites. I love this assignment. It's called the 15 puzzle. It's also one of the most difficult, so you're going to want to get started with this pretty quickly. So the idea is we have this, it's called a 15 puzzle, and we can click on elements of this to shift them around the page. At any given time, I can't like click on this 4, for example. I can only click on these 2 that are next to this empty space. So I click on that, and now there are 3 next to the empty space, and I click on this. These are 3 next to the empty space, and so on. And I can just go around and do this. The idea is that you're going to have a shuffle button here, and when you click shuffle, it's going to randomly arrange everything in a particular way, so that you're going to have to go ahead and solve it. So that's 2. Let's get 2 up there. 3, and then 4. I've graded so many of these that I got a lot of practice. Where's 7? Oh, there's 7.
Is there any possibility, do you have to solve it every time you grade it? There couldn't be any possibility.
There is now. It's the course has evolved a little bit. It's become a lot more fancy since I was involved, and now there is now sort of an auto grading tool that will figure out whether this is in a solvable state. So it solves the puzzle. Yeah, you click a button, and actually it's now animated, right? So it like actually goes through. It's an animated solve. It's pretty sweet. Yeah. So this is your next homework assignment, and it involves event handling and the DOM. It's a great homework assignment, but it's very difficult. So you're gonna want to go ahead and get started on that pretty quickly. So we'll go over. We'll do more with Json on Friday, and then I'll see you then.